Greetings and welcome to the Civic Design Center's spring event. My name is Gary Gaston, and as the CEO of the organization, it is my honor to serve alongside an outstanding staff and board of directors who work every day with passionate citizens, departments of government, business and nonprofit leaders across the city in fulfilling our mission of advocating for civic design visions and actionable change in communities to improve quality of life for all. This is our 20th year anniversary as an organization, and we want to thank all of you for being passionate supporters and contributors to the organization over the past 2 decades. Today is also the Big Payback, Middle Tennessee's 24-hour online giving day. And as a part of this event, we invite you to make a donation right now to support our work. Our goal today is to raise $12,000 to fund our tactical urbanism work. Tactical urbanism is a low-cost, fast way of making infrastructure improvements in our neighborhoods. Over the past several years, we have helped create traffic circles to slow traffic in residential areas. We have implemented road diets by painting bike lanes along high-speed corridors. We have also built beautiful parklets, painted roads with murals, and created more joyful places to just sit outside or to wait for the bus. Help us create a seed fund today to support tactical urbanism by donating during this event. Right now, today, right now, so that we may reclaim public spaces and create safer transportation infrastructure in under-resourced neighborhoods. To make a donation, simply click on the link in the chat box. I am so incredibly excited about this event because it has taken quite a long time to come together. I had the chance to meet Anthony Foxx in DC in February of 2020 when I was attending a roundtable discussion on equity and transportation. And I was so impressed by his talk and all that he has been able to accomplish during his career. And I knew that it was so applicable to everything that we're doing in Nashville. So we immediately started the work on trying to get Anthony to come here. And I'm just so excited that we've been able to work together and he's here today with us virtually. The Civic Design Center has been focused on the topic of transportation since its inception. In 2004, the Civic Design Center released the Plan of Nashville, a community-based vision plan that involved hundreds of Nashvillians who provided ideas for how they would like to see the city look and function in the future. Many of these ideas focused on transportation infrastructure and how it should be significantly rethought. Nashvillians envisioned a highly functional transportation system that also helped repair decades-old connections that were lost between communities by removing or capping sections of interstate highway and reuniting disrupted neighborhoods. And what may have seemed like outlandish ideas 20 years ago are now taking seed to become reality. This morning, I am here at Gary Music Productions with 2 individuals whom I have the utmost respect for and have had the pleasure of working with for over a decade now. Michelle Lacewell, Deputy Director of the Greater Nashville Regional Council, and Tanisha Hall, a Civic Design Center board member and CEO of Fairpoint Planning, who will be serving as our moderator today. Good morning, you two.
Good morning.
Good morning,
It's so
Gary.
good to see you. I know we're all vaccinated here, and what a great treat to actually be able to be together
Yes,
in person
absolutely.
and a little bit closer distance.
Yes.
So thank you both for waking up so early this morning and coming to join us for our spring event.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So first, I want to start with you, Michelle.
Yes.
Thank you for, first of all, for Greater GNRC for being a supporter of this event and a partner in it, but also for being a partner with the Civic Design Center for the past 15 years. What an incredible example of innovation in transportation visioning.
Absolutely. And we are thrilled to have had you as a partner for the last 15 years. We've done a lot of creative and interesting activities to help increase our planning efforts that have been led by your team, and it has been very beneficial.
Yeah, I love it. And we're looking forward to you telling us a little bit more about the work that you do with GNRC.
Absolutely. So I'll share a little bit about the Greater Nashville Regional Council. As Gary said, I'm our Deputy Director. You may know our acronym, GNRC. Excuse me. The Greater Nashville Regional Council is responsible for convening local leaders and elected officials across the Mid-State to facilitate cooperative planning and policymaking to prioritize state and federal investments into our area's social services and public infrastructure. GNRC plays a critical role as the federally certified Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, for the Greater Nashville area. MPOs are regional transportation planning bodies established in each of the nation's metro areas to develop long-term plans and to prioritize present-day funds to improve roads, bridges, transit, and other elements of our local transportation system. Earlier this year, the mayors and transportation officials on GNRC's Transportation Policy Board adopted a major update to our region's plan. This plan allocated more than $10.5 billion to transportation projects over the coming years. The public planning efforts here in Middle Tennessee are absolutely enriched by the public-private partnerships between government agencies and community-based organizations like the Civic Design Center. For more than 15 years, as we said, the Civic Design Center has been a contributing partner to our planning and policy-making efforts by engaging the community with bold ideas and offering practical guidance on how to implement those ideas through urban design solutions. As an example, GNRC and the Civic Design Center have partnered on a major revisioning of the downtown Nashville interstate loop to ensure that this key transportation asset not only remains viable for decades to come, but it also helps uplift surrounding neighborhoods who have too often been negatively impacted by our infrastructure projects. This morning is just another example of our close collaboration as we host Secretary Foxx to inspire our region to achieve success. I'm personally honored to be here to help welcome him to our virtual stage. I last had the opportunity to see the Secretary in 2013 when he was hosting his Invest in America bus tour. We had the privilege of meeting with him and area mayors at that time. We are fortunate to have his leadership at the national level, but it is his experience as a mayor working at a regional MPO level that makes him especially important to today's conversation. So on behalf of the 93 members of the Regional Council and our 80 staff members at GNRC, I want to thank Gary and his team at the Civic Design Center for inviting us to be part of today's event. We very much look forward to the Secretary's remarks. And now I'm going to hand it off to our moderator, Tanisha.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks, Gary, for having me here today. Hello, everyone. I'm Tanisha Hall, CEO and founder at Fairpoint Planning, a management consulting firm focused on transportation planning, stakeholder, and public engagement and outreach. I am so excited to introduce our guest speaker today. I was Director of Planning for the Tennessee Department of Transportation when I heard about then Mayor Foxx of Charlotte, North Carolina. He played an integral role in transforming Charlotte after the recession and led the city's investment in the Blue Line Transit project. In 2013, Secretary Foxx was appointed as head of transportation under the Obama administration. During his tenure, we saw some of the biggest changes in transportation, and he directed initiatives to move the country forward with freight, technology, and multimodal transportation. I got a chance to see him speak at several transportation conferences when he passionately talked about his personal upbringing and how it was impacted by transportation. He used that experience to shape programs like Ladders of Opportunity to help reduce barriers in the built environment for minority and underserved communities. After his departure from the U.S. Department of Transportation, Mr. Foxx held policy positions with different organizations, most recently serving as Chief Policy Officer with Lyft. We are so excited to welcome you to the Civic Design Center Spring event. But first, we have a question. You've accomplished so much: lawyer, councilman, mayor, United States Department of Transportation Secretary. What should we call you?
Thank you, Tanisha. Anthony is just fine. The name I was born with, so it works out pretty well.
Got it. Got it. Thank you so much, Anthony, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. And it's great. It's great to join you, Gary, Michelle, Tanisha. Thank you so much for all the great work you're doing in the greater Nashville area. And I really appreciate all of you who are listening and watching today for joining. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes here, and I'm looking forward to the questions and answers, hopefully the answers that I will provide. But I really wanted to talk to you today about what I think is one of the most urgent issues facing not only Nashville, but the entire country, which is the concept of American renewal. You know, whatever your baseline is for understanding where we are in time, I think it's fair to say that as great a country as we live in, we have the capacity to be greater still. And whether that's economically, whether that is healing some of the political divides that we have in our country, whether that's improving our transportation and infrastructure systems, there's a lot of work for all of us to do. And it really starts with an aspiration. So today I'll be talking from the subject, Fulfilling the Promise, Transportation, Equity, and American Renewal. I want to start with a picture. And if we can go to the next slide. And the picture is of of two people here. You may not be familiar with this photograph, but I think it is it's really the touchstone that I will use for this entire talk. The gentleman on the right is a gentleman named Bill Connor. You may not know who Bill Connor is, but Bill Connor tragically lost his daughter on a vacation a few years ago. His daughter's name was Abby. And it turns out that Abby was an organ donor. And her heart was transplanted into the person on the left. And his name is Lawnmouth Jack. He lives in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And Bill did a bicycle tour from where he lives up in Wisconsin all the way down to Louisiana. And what he's doing in this photograph is he's taking a stethoscope to listen to his daughter's heart beating in Lawnmouth Jack. And I use this visual because it is reconciling things, so many things that are hard for us to think about reconciling as a culture. Race, biology, distance, time. And when I think about what our transportation system is capable of doing, it is bringing us together in real ways. And so I want this visual to maybe stay with you, because what I'm going to say today is going to, and I'm going to get into some touchy subjects, but I want you to understand that my intent in doing so is to bring us to a place where we can truly live and thrive together as one American community. Now let's go to the next slide. So I you know, one of my jobs, you didn't mention this, Tanisha, but pitching for the Yankees was one job that I used to have. But I use baseball as a bit of an analogy, and I'll come back to it. But when you think about American infrastructure, we have been the envy of the world for so many generations. An end-to-end rail system sponsored by President Abraham Lincoln, then built on top of that, an interstate highway system, airports. We have some of the most sophisticated infrastructure in the entire world. Next slide. And the thing about that infrastructure that one has to imagine is that the infrastructure was built with a lot of intention behind it. And that's why I use baseball as a bit of an analogy. You know, baseball has this rule that says that home plate should be should be directed towards the east-northeast. And the reason for that is that that is the one direction in which the sun will not go into the batter's eye. And so it's incredible to think about these multi-million dollar, sometimes billion-dollar stadiums, and a small detail like which direction the plate should face, it is something that we've thought about. And if a detail like that can be something we've thought about previously, then the details of how our infrastructure has been built will also have been thought about in a very similar way. And I mentioned this and use a baseball analogy to say that even the finest details about our infrastructure system have undergone great thought, which when you look back over the last 60, 70 years, is a bit depressing when you think about how much communities have been uprooted by some of the infrastructure decisions. But we have to understand that these decisions were made knowing what some of the impacts would be. Let's go to the next slide. So a brief history, I'm going to use highways as an example, but we could really be talking about any infrastructure. But let's focus on highways for a minute. Next slide. This is President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower, military hero, father of the interstate highway system. And it was a bold vision, a vision that had two general purposes. One, national defense, the other one, getting farmers to population centers. The idea of the interstate highway system was the federal government would underwrite 92% of the cost of building this massive system. And it has been a tremendous economic asset, as you can see, generating $6 for every dollar spent. And it did accomplish much of what it was designed to do, which was to spur commerce and to provide us with an end-to-end transportation system. Those things cannot be questioned. However, as it was being built, there was a lot of opposition that came up from place to place about the placement of these freeways. And you have to know that in the 1950s, we're talking pre-Voting Rights Act, many communities, particularly African-American communities, particularly in the South, were not at the table. And so the opposition from many of the white communities was taken much more seriously, much more robustly than any opposition that might have come from some of these other communities. As a result, the freeway system emerged as a reflection of the time. The planning, the design, the construction, the implementation of it is a relic of the age in which it was built. And so it's not surprising that we have some of the vestiges of it today. Next paragraph, next slide. Tom McDonald was the initial Bureau of Roads director. And frankly, the idea of an interstate system had been around since the 19-teens. And again, his view was the idea was to get farmers out of the mud. And he really believed that that was the central theme of getting this system constructed. There were other thinkers in the country, the most prominent of which is our next figure, who was a gentleman by the name of Robert Moses. If you have ever read the book, you can go to the next slide. If you ever read the book, The Power Broker, it's a great book that explains the worldview that Moses had. He was a big thinker, did a lot of very positive things, but he also used transportation as a bit of a weapon to undercut some communities. The Bronx-Queens Expressway, for example, went out of its way to take down some of the apartment buildings of integrated communities in the New York area. And when he talked about this project in Baltimore that we today call the Freeway to Nowhere, literally a freeway that bifurcated traditionally African-American community and was never finished. What he says about it is what the attitudes of the time were, which was, this is a great way to basically eliminate slums in the city of Baltimore and make it healthier in the long run. So, you know, the next figure starts to get into my time frame. On April 20th, 1971, 10 days before I was born, there was a court case that decided that that busing was an effective way to implement Brown v. Board of Education. That case was tried initially in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I'm from, and Julius Chambers is the lawyer who tried this case. I mention it because my coming of age, my earliest recollections and involvement with transportation came on long bus rides to school as part of this decision. And I'll talk about it perhaps a little later, but it informed a lot of how I understand transportation as a way of bringing people together. Let's go to the next slide. This is my home in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's in the northwest part of the city. The neighborhood is my grandparents who helped raise me. Those are some embarrassing pictures of my childhood, but I can't fit that suit anymore. But anyway, the point is that the neighborhood was a very good place to live. A lot of teachers lived on the street like my grandparents were. But one feature of the neighborhood was that it was hemmed in by two freeways, I-85 and I-77, two of the largest freeways on the eastern seaboard. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to kind of hone in on where my neighborhood was. If you look at it on two sides, you pretty much are hemmed in, and actually the area is surrounded by freeways. And growing up, I didn't think anything about it. But as I started to learn more about planning, design, I started to notice a pattern of where a lot of African-American communities were, a lot of low-income communities were situated around freeways. And it was kind of a chicken or the egg kind of question. What came first? Did these neighborhoods populate first and then the freeways, or vice versa? Next slide. Well, as it turns out, in Charlotte, there had been a neighborhood known as Brooklyn. Brooklyn was in the central business district of the city and occupied a place that we called Second Ward. And there were, I don't know, 1,200 households in that area. There was a high school. This is Second Ward High School here, all African-American school. There were music and entertainment venues that Black citizens could go to. Of course, they couldn't go to some of the white ones, or they had to sit in the balcony in those. But it was really kind of the thriving part of the Black community. Again, in a time when Blacks could not go to many of the white areas. But as early as 1912, the Charlotte Observer, the local paper, it started identifying this area as a place that could serve a higher and better use as an area where whites could frequent. And so even from that early time, there were thoughts about redoing Second Ward. And you can see here this map showing in the yellow areas that were highly African-American and the pink areas that were more populated by whites. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, urban renewal program allowed much of Second Ward to be raised. And in partnership with the Urban Renewal Grant, there was an effort to create a freeway that would connect this particular part of Charlotte. And so this community that people had grown up around had memories, high school proms and dances, all the things that we all associate with our place and time. And those things were largely destroyed. Next. As I said, I was thinking about what came first, chicken or the egg here. And you look at 1950s, 1960s, 1970s up to today, this is the development of the freeway system in Charlotte. And what's interesting about this is that when you look at where the wealth was populated in the city of Charlotte from an earlier time to now, it's a very interesting sort of evolution. You go to the next slide, I think we'll get there. This is 1960s, and the blue areas are actually the wealthier areas. The red areas are the poorer areas. And if you look up until the 2010s, I think is what the latest we have. Next slide. You'll see that this map almost inverts. Can we go to the next slide? And you start to see the poverty concentrating around the freeways. It's an interesting trend that you see from place to place. So it does seem to me that we have historically utilized our freeway system as a way of perhaps depressing property value and making things harder for people who live nearby them. Let's go to the next slide. So my team, USDOT, looked at household displacement over the course of the highway construction and development phase. And this is the number of households that were displaced over time through 1977. But the darker shaded areas are the number of African American and minorities that were displaced. And so clearly a disproportionate number of them were affected by this program. Next slide. This, again, was not just a Charlotte phenomenon. This is what one of the highways in Miami did to the Overtown neighborhood. Let's go to the next slide. The Staten Island Expressway in New York, famously bifurcated community there. Let's go to the next slide. St. Paul, Minnesota, near where George Floyd's killing occurred. The Rondo neighborhood there was one that was bifurcated by a freeway. Next. The Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans. My good friend Wynton Marsalis talks about how there used to be a parade in one of the areas where the Claiborne Expressway was placed. And as soon as that highway came there, the parade stopped. So again, these aspects of life were eliminated. Next slide. Los Angeles, I-10. Next slide. Seattle, I-5. Almost every urban center has a story like this. And parenthetically, we just were able to bury the viaduct in Seattle that runs along the Pacific Ocean, and they've now opened that part of the horizon up in the city, and it's now a lot better looking. Next. Even rural areas experience this type of thing, and whether it's farmers or whomever, there were obviously impacts to rural areas as well. Next. Montgomery, Alabama. I won't go much into this story, but there's a number of situations there where we tried to intervene, even in my time, to reverse some of these impacts. Nevertheless, progress to continue building the system continued post the assassination of President Kennedy. Obviously, there was a renewed effort to put in civil rights legislation, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 proved pivotal because finally communities that had historically been turned a deaf ear towards had at least an opportunity to influence who got elected in their communities, who made these decisions. Next. I've been focusing on airports, highways, but airports are also another place. My neighborhood was hemmed in by a freeway, but if I looked up in the sky at any given time, there were a whole lot of airplanes because the airport was nearby too. And we have also a history of air noise affecting low income and poor communities as well. In St. Louis, this is Lambert Airfield, and there's a story about Lambert. There was a neighborhood that this airport was built around. Next slide. The neighborhood ended up being a place people got relocated and ended up moving to Ferguson, where we've had issues within the last decade. Fewer than 48% of low-income areas have adequate sidewalks. And this is probably a scene you may have seen in Nashville. It's very common to see people creating their own sidewalks in the absence of one. It's actually pretty unsafe. And one of the stories that I ran across as transportation secretary was about, I think it's the next slide, about a young lady named Raquel Nelson, who she had 2 kids and had taken the bus with her kids to go to the grocery store. She comes back home, gets to the bus stop, and home is directly across the street from where the bus stop is. But the nearest crosswalk is about half a mile up the road. And I won't ask for a show of hands of how many people would walk a half mile to go to the safe crosswalk and then walk back half a mile to get home after a long day at the grocery store. But suffice it to say that Miss Nelson decided to take the shortest distance between 2 points. Well, she's got groceries in her hands, 2 kids hanging on her, and one of the children loses contact with her and ends up getting struck and killed by a car. And we find that pedestrian and bicycle deaths in low-income communities is disproportionately high because the infrastructure is not as good. Can we go to the next slide? So this is a depiction of the situation I was just describing, where, and this is an actual street where this accident occurred. But as you can see, the crosswalk is quite a distance away. So in this situation, we lost a young person, mostly because we hadn't figured out how to create more access points across that street. Next. This is a map of the Atlanta metro area. The orangish colored areas are where most of the bicycle and pedestrian fatalities have occurred, and the grayish areas are where the lowest income areas are. So there is a significant overlap in terms of low income and bike pedestrian fatalities and accidents. Next slide. So I've described a lot of problems. I've tried to give you a bit of a sense of where our infrastructure has succeeded, but also where it's let us down. I do think it's important to maybe point out that all of this has a social dimension. When the infrastructure is built in such a way that we don't come in contact with each other, that creates a cycle of isolation, which creates a cycle of misunderstanding. And I think that, in my lifetime, it's been the casual interactions with people who I might not have met or come in contact with otherwise that have really enriched me and allowed me to enhance my understanding of other people. And so I think that in a country that is as heterogeneous as our country is, that is as plural as our country is, it is really critical that our infrastructure not only provide us with efficient ways of getting places, not only serve as an economic catalyst, but also serve as a catalyst for creating those spontaneous interactions that allow us to reaffirm ourselves as a single community. So I've thought a little bit about how policy can help us do that. And I'm talking primarily here federal policy. And this is where I'll start wrapping up. We got the FAST Act passed as a result of the bus tour that Michelle discussed earlier. And we need another package. In September, the infrastructure bill that we passed back in 2015 is going to expire. And frankly, that bill, while it put more money in place than we had before, it still was undersized against our overall need. And I'm glad to see the new administration talking about doing a big, bold infrastructure plan. The second thing, though, putting a big amount of money in place is necessary, but it's not sufficient, because we need more programmatic change in order to realize the opportunities in front of us. And there are several here that I'll point out. One is our transit systems are not profitable. They don't even break even. And the pandemic has only worsened the financial situation for these transit agencies. Thankfully, Congress has provided money that helps to shore them up. But I really think that we need some amount of ongoing operating support in perpetuity for these transit agencies that really do connect so many people who otherwise don't have transportation alternatives. And this is important from an equity standpoint, because for most people, transportation is the second largest expense in their budgets, behind housing. And so to the extent that we can continue to provide people with lower cost alternatives to owning vehicles and things like that, it makes our country more affordable, and it allows people to realize their potential. The second thing is I served on an MPO, and I believe in them. And I actually think that we have under invested in our MPO RPO system. So I would put dramatically greater amount of money towards these MPOs and RPOs so they can actually build projects and get things done. But I would also make a requirement that they do this in regional, truly mega regional environments, meaning that in our country, if you break it down into where the economies of our country exist, we're actually made up of 11 mega economies within the country, and our transportation planning does not recognize those mega economies. We need to, I think, manage our transportation planning much more aggressively towards where the economic communities of interest are. And so I would put more money in the MPOs and RPOs, but I'd also require that they do joint planning within their MPOs and RPOs and mega regions. Next, today we have a very formulaic approach to transportation funding. The Highway Trust Fund puts 80 cents on a dollar into roads and 20 cents on a dollar into transit. I would blow that up. And I think allowing states and localities to make investments in modalities that make the most sense for them is a better approach. And I don't think it has to be done without some standards the federal government sets in terms of climate, in terms of congestion reduction and so forth. But I think you can be more mode neutral today than in the past. Next, I actually think it's a good idea for the country to have a chief national planner. We don't have that today. And as a result, we don't get a regular health check on our transportation system. We don't get a regular check on how well policy is set up to help us achieve national objectives in transportation. And I think having something, and again, I kind of joke about this, but having someone like a Tony Fauci or a Federal Reserve Chair who who is non-political, has a long-term appointment, maybe sits with a small board, but the job is basically to be the voice for the future of our infrastructure, non-political voice. I think the country could use that. Next, public input is one of the big reasons why we fell down on equity in earlier times. In some cases, there was little. In other cases, there was none. In some cases, there was some, but it wasn't where it needed to be. There were problems with remunerating people's property losses. There's all kinds of stuff when you look back that was done incorrectly and unjustly, frankly. And so I think the federal government can encourage more experimentation with innovative public input options. We now have the capability to do things like we're doing today, where you don't have to be in a physical room to provide input or questions in a conversation like we're having today. That's exactly the type of thing that I think we need to be doing. And we also need to be thinking about that for people who don't have broadband today, although I hope everybody has it soon based on the infrastructure package. But we need to make sure that it's high tech and low tech. And then, perhaps a little controversial here is, our TIPs, the state transportation improvement plans, seem to keep adding things, but very rarely do you see things taken off. And I actually think we should encourage states to audit their tip lists. And a lot of times this is tough because it's political. People have been counting on a road for the last 20 years that hasn't been built. But I do think we need to start assessing what do we actually need today? What do we not need? Are there things that are being maintained today that aren't providing a significant travel advantage? And does the old street grid do just as well? I think that's where we will start to have a serious conversation about removing projects off of the tip list and even tearing down some projects that are up today. And then finally, I think design standards around our freeways need a very careful look. We did some things at USDOT, like the Every Place Counts Challenge, where we actually started working with groups like ULI, communities, state departments of transportation, groups like we're talking to today, to start looking at, okay, if you've got to build it anyway, can you make it an asset rather than a liability to these communities? And there are actually a lot of things that can be done, capping freeways, building parks near them. There's all sorts of things that can be done to make these assets and facilities more attractive and more usable by the people who live nearby them. So those are just a few ideas about the future. Next slide. So I'm ending where I started. I think that we overstate how different these various communities are. We're all people. When there's been war, our relatives have all fought. When there's been illness, we've all banded together. When there have been pandemics, we've tried to work as a single community, and that's where the heart of America is. And we won't achieve the very best we can achieve if we're fighting against our infrastructure to get there. So the work you all are doing is incredibly important. I ask you to continue taking the work very seriously. Sometimes it'll be a little contentious, but if it's in the spirit of love of country and love of each other, we will get there. So with that, let me stop and maybe have some questions, and I appreciate you all's attention.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a very, very thought-provoking and inspiring presentation that you gave. And we have probably a lot of questions to ask after that.
Yes.
I'll turn it over to Gary right quick.
Yeah, before we get started with the questions and the community discussion, I think we've got a really good amount of time to have great discussion here. I just want to give an update, and we have reached 50% towards our goal of the $12,000 today to help fund our tactical urbanism, transportation-focused projects for Nashville neighborhoods. So thanks to everybody for giving, and there's still time between now and the end of the program. We want to get to the $12,000 goal, so thank you. And then I'll turn it back over to Tanisha for our community discussion.
Thanks so much, Gary. We have a few questions from different community members, and I think I might take moderator's privilege and ask you a question, because that last slide with the recommendations, there were a lot of things, all the things, as the kids would say, all the things are on that slide. You talked about lower cost transportation options, looking at lower cost transportation options for particularly communities of color. Transportation demand management has been around forever, but it's something that people really they don't want to grasp, using carpooling, van pooling, using transit and things like that. What are some ways you think would encourage more people, more communities to invest in those types of options?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's a really important and urgent question in fast-growing places like Nashville. I think the first thing is that we have to help people recognize that the travel time they had 10 years ago is gone. If it took you 15 minutes to get from one part of Nashville to another part, it's probably 20, 25 minutes today. And in the future, it's going to be longer than that if we continue the same practices going forward. So I think giving people a real sense that we're not, the default is not the same thing we have today or even had yesterday, that actually things are going to continue. There's going to be more pressure on the transportation system if we keep putting more pressure on it. If we can get there, then I think you can have a conversation with folks about, okay, so what are we all doing that is adding to the load on this system, and how can we offload? And that's when you get into some of the demand management practices you're talking about. And I actually think one of the most underutilized demand management systems is land use. When we are able to walk to the grocery store, or walk to the pharmacy, or walk to our job, or what have you, that takes cars off the road, or even bicycling. And those are incredibly clean ways to travel. They're also ways that improve health. So, I think the pandemic in some ways has given people renewed interest in what the junkies call micromobility. And I think micromobility is part of the mix of things that we need. In terms of pooling and transit and that sort of thing, I hope that we're able to get over this public health crisis we're in right now, because I think that is a constraint on shared rides of any type. But assuming that happens relatively quickly, I think the operating support of our transit systems is critical for that reason. So the services are available and convenient to people and plentiful, so people can make use of them. But then I also think we need to make a massive push to help people understand that every car trip we take is creating more of the congestion we all hate. And so it's part of our civic responsibility to try to share these rides where we can.
Thank you. So next, I'll turn it over to Michelle Lacewell. She has some questions from the Greater Nashville Regional Council.
Sure.
Thank you. And I want to thank you for your comments related to the work that MPOs do. I know a lot of our staff members are watching right now, and they greatly appreciated you recognizing the value and the work that we do as an organization. Along those lines, the mayors, through the MPO efforts, the mayors across Middle Tennessee have worked really hard and put a lot of effort into developing regional transportation plans over the last few years, many of which are targeted at addressing a lot of the issues that you touched on in your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you have for our mayors as they are trying to inspire our residents to invest in transit? That you mentioned, you know, the lack of dedicated funding for transit that exists across the country, but, you know, obviously there's a challenge here in Middle Tennessee. So as we, you know, move forward out of the pandemic and re-energize ourselves around this conversation, what advice do you have for our mayors as they engage their residents to invest in transit?
Yeah, it's great, a great point. It's the way I would describe it is we need to think big as leaders. And when I say that, what I'm saying is, by virtue of what the MPO does, you're already thinking bigger than any one jurisdiction that the MPO serves. But if you think about the different economies that are part of the MPOs that you're a part of, you know, you've got, and again, I haven't done an extensive analysis on Middle Tennessee, but I know you've got some automobile manufacturing going on in Tennessee. You've got healthcare, you've got universities, you've got these different nodes of economic growth that are not just part of your area, but they're part of a larger area. And I actually think connecting those larger areas, these may cross state lines, by the way. They may cross MPO lines, but starting to galvanize leaders across Tennessee, maybe going into Kentucky, maybe going into Georgia, saying what is it that we need to grow jobs in this region that's bigger than any one of our jurisdictions, and how do we start painting that picture? It might be freight rail investments, it might be you know, airport investments, it might be any range of things. But I think people right now, the average citizen is looking for what is my future going to be like, and who's out there trying to help fight for the kind of job growth and the kind of opportunities that I need for my children and my grandchildren. And I really think connecting our planning to that is one of the most important things. And so transit falls in as one of the inputs. But I think the main thing is making sure the public understands what the overall output is. Where are we going? And I would involve the chambers of commerce. I would involve state government. I would involve everyone who's got a voice, and build a campaign around it. You know, maybe it's, you know, Middle Tennessee next or something, but give people a sense of where you're headed and what it will feel like to them when you're done with all the investments you're talking about.
That's great. And I appreciate the comment of the vision and what it will feel like when we're done. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. So next we have some comments and questions from some members of the community organizations that are prominent in the Nashville area. So first we're going to go to Faye DeMassimo. She's with the mayor's office, and she's, I believe, the senior advisor to the mayor. Faye, are you ready with your question? Okay. Oh. Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties right now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes. Thank you, Faye.
It said I had to request to unmute, and I was trying frantically to do so.
No problem. We hear you loud and clear right now.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to ask this question. So, you know, Metro Nashville has had quite the year. I'm sure that you've heard about it, Mr. Fox. We've had tornadoes and civil unrest and bombing and flooding, and it's been quite the year. In addition to those kinds of things, though, we've also had quite the year in transportation. We've got Metro Nashville's first transportation plan. We are standing up a Department of Transportation that will be a first for Metro. But equity is a top of mind issue across America. And it really is for us as well. We've developed a tool called Equity by Design that is intended to help us build multiple facets of equity into literally the design of each project, with the thought that if we're building equity into every project, the system itself reflects that. But I would be grateful to hear your thoughts on what are some of the specifics we can do to keep equity top of mind, and more importantly, to really achieve those aims of equity, not just here, but in cities across America.
Yeah, it's great question. Faye, it's a really it's a question I love, because when George Floyd was killed, and then we had a succession of other highly visible deaths of African Americans at the hands of police. There's this discussion across the country about, it's time to have a hard conversation. It's time to have an uncomfortable conversation. And I as important as I think it is, I think the conversations can become abstract. And what's exciting about the work you're describing is that it's very specific. It's very grounded in decision making that has a tangible output. So I think one of the most, when we talk about having uncomfortable conversations, this is the uncomfortable conversation. You're right in the middle of it if you're talking about equity in transportation. And the uncomfortable part is, number one, we as transportation planners have to go out into these communities that have historically been underserved, and we have to engage with them in a real way, which, hasn't always happened. We have to listen, and we have to talk in plain English and not use transportationese, as I call it. We have to talk plainly to folks, and we have to listen plainly to folks. And then those folks need to see the things that they have conveyed actualized in the outcome of a project. And over time, we will build trust that we've never had in the transportation sector. And that trust will create social capital. And that social capital will create community. And so it's a lot of work, but I believe less in sort of an abstract, uncomfortable conversation. I believe more in one that's based and rooted in actual decision making, and that's the opportunity you have.
No, I want to add one quick thing, if the moderator will give me a moment of privilege to that, that I also think is important, is we are, some of the images that you showed early in your presentation around the bifurcation of historic Black communities. We have that situation here and have a project that's been underway in the Civic Design Center, and others have worked on it for years, but we're bringing it forward for a major funding opportunity called the Jefferson Street CAP. Mm-hmm. And we very purposefully have done nothing on the actual design of the project, because we want the community to design the project. And I think that that's another way that we build trust, is by asking people what they want, that reuniting, that healing, and so forth. What do they want it to look like as a piece of infrastructure? And we're excited about that.
Yeah. And if I could also say, all of us need to be healed. All of us. It's the communities that were damaged were obviously injured and harmed, but it also did injury to any of us who were part of the system. And I would venture to say that, our traffic engineers, our planners, designers, construction workers, there's something in this for everybody in terms of just learning in a different way what is possible when we really engage each other. And that's what's exciting to me, is seeing, I can't even imagine the amazing things that are going to happen in Nashville if this work is done well. But I promise you, it'll punch way above transportation.
Are we bringing the people up when they ask a question?
Thank you.
To see them?
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Faye. Next, we'll hear, keeping along the lines of equity, we'll hear from Mr. Clifton Harris. He's the CEO and president of the Urban League of Middle Tennessee. Mr. Harris, are you ready for us right now?
I am.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Foxx, for your insight and your expertise, on this subject, and thank you, for the service that you have given our country in this area. So my question is related to the Federal Highway Administration's development of a community impact assessment process that focuses on the human impact that should be done, or methodology that should be done on any transportation project. And it identifies, 4 benefits of the social and economic impacts of transportation projects. Can you speak to the benefits of research that evaluates transportation policies and trends in terms of human, social, and economic impacts? Because we never really get to that seemingly here in Nashville, the impact, the social and economic impact that's going to happen to our communities. And so I'd like to hear more about those benefits.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think on the benefit side, the types of things that we should be measuring and placing high value are access, meaning access to jobs, access to schools, access to healthcare, access to those sorts of things. We should also be looking at the degree to which the assets we put in place build economic strength in certain areas. In other words, sometimes a transportation facility can attract jobs into an area that has historically been underserved by job creation. And in fact, we initiated a pilot program, which I hope becomes law soon, that enabled construction companies and states to encourage the hiring of people near where construction projects were happening. And so we built skills training around that. And it was actually pretty successful as a pilot. So I think those are the types of things. And then there's, of course, we can also think in terms of what the impact is on property values and other more tangible financial upsides to some of the investments that can be made. Let me just say this though, that and I'm an environmentalist, and I believe we've got to tackle climate change aggressively, and I believe in protecting endangered species. But there are, in some cases, endangered species that have gotten greater protections than human beings in this country by infrastructure planners. And that's something that we hopefully will see a better balance struck going forward. So hopefully, we'll have to stay vigilant. And, I think with this new administration, it's important for communities to engage not only at the state level, but even at the USDOT level, as you see planning projects happening or things happening that you think may not be serving us well in terms of those benefits.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And for the rest of the questions, we have about 35 minutes left. So we want to make sure that we get to all of the questions. So if you can keep your questions short, and then we can make sure we hear from Mr. Foxx. Next, we're going to move to Jessica Dolphin. She's with the Transit Alliance here in Middle Tennessee. Jessica, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Awesome.
Thank you. Mr. Foxx, it's been great to see your presentation. Simply brilliant. Thanks for joining us today. Now I'm going to take you back a little bit. As mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, when you were leading the charge for transformational infrastructure investments and changes, how did you overcome NIMBYs and naysayers saying that it couldn't be done? How did you leverage community engagement and local advocates in that effort?
Great question. I'd say mixed success with what you're asking, and I frankly would say that if I would feel bad if I didn't have mixed success, because that would mean that I was just doing stuff that was easy. I think the easier projects that I worked on were ones where there was already a component on the ground. So, for example, in 2007, we opened the first segment of light rail in Charlotte. And in the downturn in 2009, we lost a bunch of revenue, and it threatened the extension of that project that I was charged as mayor with continuing. And we were able to get it continued, but there was low public opposition to continuing it. It was more of a math and revenue problem. But because we had a segment that was already successful in place. Now contrast that with a streetcar project that we started that was really designed to connect the lower income parts of the city in a less disruptive way than a light rail dedicated lane would affect them. That was a real dogfight for me, and frankly, out of some unusual places. There were people on the corridors themselves who were concerned about property tax escalation, and that's a legitimate concern. There were people, outside those areas who called the project a project to nowhere, which was I found a bit insulting. But nevertheless, that was a sentiment that was out there. And, when it comes to some of these types of projects, the constituency, I think the best model is building the constituency for these projects as they're in the planning process. And unfortunately for us, we were in a situation where we had a long-range transit plan that had been in place since 2005. But because the progress had been slow, a lot of the momentum behind it had been kind of dissipated. And so I didn't have a critical mass of support behind what I was doing from a public standpoint, and therefore it made it hard. So, I think for mayors and for public leaders, this has to be a constant conversation, and those who are advocating for it need to be in constant conversation, both the politicals as well as the community supporters. And, if you have one success, don't rest on that success, like continue the conversation so that people know there's more success out there. But I think when we got the first light rail line built, I think we stopped cheering for ourselves, and that was a mistake.
Thank you so much. Along those lines, we have a question from someone from our audience. I'll paraphrase this a little bit, but they're basically saying cities making efforts to improve harmed areas by the interstate, but gentrification has forced people out of their neighborhoods because of the improvements that are supposed to help. What can be done about the displacement issue that happens when investment a lot of times equates displacement?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a question of balance. I grew up in an area that was, middle to low income, and there were amenities that we did not have in that neighborhood. We didn't have, dry cleaners. We didn't have decent grocery stores. We didn't have a decent pharmacy nearby. And I think that our economy should be healthy enough to attract those types of things to more communities. So, the idea of economic growth in a given area isn't entirely bad. But at the same time, as areas become more attractive for those types of things, they become more attractive overall. And so, again, I think the question is balance. Now, there are some things that I think cities can and should do to help mitigate. One of them is as a city is starting to identify areas for improvement, create a land trust, involve the public and private sectors in buying up land and making that land usable for the creation of affordable housing. Where states have the capability to do property tax abatement, particularly for senior citizens, I think that's another tool that could be utilized in cases like this. But I think that one has to pay attention to the overall economic impact of even, well-intended transportation decisions, so that we can strike as good of a balance as possible. But let me say one last thing, is that, and this is going to sound maybe a little coarse, but it's not entirely bad for a family that might have spent, $100,000 on a house to be able to take $300,000 off the table when that house gains value, and to be able to repurpose it. So there will be people who make good decisions to sell in these situations, but the idea is that no one should have to if they don't want to. The economics shouldn't force people out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So next we'll move to Adam Nicholson, and he's with Transit Now, Nashville. Adam, you with us?
Yes, happy to be here. Thanks for talking with us, Mr. Fox.
Sure.
My first question was the one that was just answered, so that's great. Really good ways to alleviate that pattern. I'd say a follow-up could be Austin passed their $300 million anti-displacement fund. Do you think it's too soon to learn lessons from what they're doing?
It's probably a little soon, but I'm glad that we have at least some effort being undertaken. Mayor Adler down there is a sharp guy, and he's got a good game plan for it. But a lot of it is in how it's executed, and we'll see.
Thank you. I could ask another question if I have the moment. It's could you tell us a favorite example of a community-led vision for transportation investments?
Yeah, when we did the Every Place Counts design challenge with ULI, I actually went to Philadelphia and spent time in a community. It was actually a highly populated Asian American community in central Philadelphia that had been bifurcated by a freeway. And we spent an entire day doing a visioning exercise. And it was interesting because the way we set it up, the states have oftentimes been the villain in these situations, but we brought the state to the table with the community. And for the state transportation officials, it was probably one of the more close-up experiences they'd had in a visioning process with the community, because oftentimes they're coming in at the public input phase, but the visioning actually happens someplace else. So I think it was instructive not only for the community but also for the transportation officials. And my understanding is, like Nashville, there is still work being done to try to realize the vision that we came up with that day. So it's really invigorating to see that.
Thank you, Adam. And next we'll move to Nora Kern with Walk Bike Nashville. Mm-hmm. Nora, are you there? Yay, we have video.
I figured I'd turn it on to say hi.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciated it. I guess slightly different direction. I really appreciated in your presentation that you touched on pedestrian safety multiple times. And unfortunately in Nashville, 2020 was the deadliest year in the history of our city for people walking. And it really feels like for cities like Nashville and Charlotte and many other cities that are really over the last 70 years developed for cars, this is a conversation we're having every year, and the problem seems to keep continuing to get worse and not turn around. So I was curious if you had any maybe top suggestions in terms of what you think we need to do differently as transportation leaders, advocates, engineers, planners, to really ensure that we don't continue to keep having record-setting deaths on our roadways.
Yeah. Let me ask you a couple of questions. How many miles of bike lane do you have in Nashville?
Oh, I should probably know that off the top of my head, but I would say protected bike lanes, probably, under 20.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the infrastructure, the bike lane infrastructure has been tough to get built because a lot of city transportation departments are choosing between sidewalks and bike lanes, and sidewalks generally are going to get more of the benefit of the doubt than the bike lanes are. And there hasn't been sustained federal programming to support that. And of course, states, so a lot of it kind of comes down to getting the facilities at a higher level of prioritization at every level, city, state, as well as federal. And I think the stars are aligning a little bit towards that. So I feel that we may see a wave of more pedestrian bicycle investment coming down the road. Another perhaps less focused on aspect of this is both driver and bicyclist education in particular. I'm not satisfied with the degree of driver education we have in this country right now. And a lot of drivers don't understand that bicycles are vehicles and they are to be treated as though they were cars on the roadways, and that means yielding in the same ways and et cetera. And I see some motorists treat bicycles as competition for the road, and that's we need to do a better job as a society of educating drivers at the point that they start driving about that. The last thing I'll point out is I know that a number of communities during COVID experienced shutting down some of their streets and using them for bike and pedestrian thoroughfares. And people were finding new ways to commute by bicycle. I hope that's a trend that stays post-COVID. I hope that in Nashville you can find ways to maybe there's a thoroughfare that you can dedicate to biking, and that will eliminate some of the modal competition for the roadway. But we need to deal with all those things at the same time.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Nora. So, transportation intersects almost every aspect of our lives. And so we want to also hear from the design community. And so we have Joseph Cole from NOMA Nashville to ask a question for you right now, Mr. Foxx. Joseph.
Hello, Anthony. Thank you for your time in this awesome presentation. On one of your last slides, you provided us with a lot of strategies and solutions based around infrastructure and planning. But as an architect and a firm owner, I'm interested in learning how we as designers can push public transit forward. Can you give us some suggestions in that realm?
Pushing public transit forward? Yeah. I think, obviously, I know that you guys were recently on the road to doing a big exercise around transit within the area. I actually remember back when I was transportation secretary that you were looking at a bus rapid transit line. And, a lot of transit projects suffer near-death experiences, and when you're pushing for expansion of transit or new transit modalities, it will be a frustratingly start, stop, fit and start kind of process. The main thing I would say is that you need to just stick with it and, learn from the times when you fall down, but just keep getting back up, because, I think you have, a number of strong ideas in the Nashville area of how you would effectively use transit, but it's about trying to get the resources in place and convince enough people in your area as well as the state to step up and get it done. And, frankly, I happen to think that communities have a 4-year window to figure this out. And that's not a political statement, by the way. I just know this administration is thinking big, and I know they're making big bets. And I know that we have limited capacity as a country to fund everything into infinity. And so if this is the moment to do something big, then we need to do it. And, recognize that at some point we're going to be a lot more constrained resource-wise at the federal level. So while the federal government's open for business, I hope communities like Nashville will pick it up and get something done.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Joseph. So we have Civic Design Center we're not just working with professionals in the industry trying to make sure we get people involved. We're also working with youth in the community. And Civic Design Center has a Nashville youth design team. And one of their members, Sabina, she recorded a message because she's in school right now. So we don't want her cutting class just so she can talk to Anthony Foxx. So we're going to play that pre-recorded question for you.
Oh, cool.
Hello, I was just wondering how youth could be involved in the development and choices made for Nashville.
So if you didn't hear that, she wants to know how youth can be involved in the development of Nashville.
I love the question. It's a great question. And, I think one of the things that I think young people have the advantage of is just seeing things that us old heads don't see. I know that in my case, my kids who are teenagers, they have written into their DNA almost a concern about climate that is fiercely urgent because they see the world they're going to inherit, and they have a low tolerance for some of the equity problems that they probably will inherit to some degree. So what I would say is, through your city council, through your student councils within the schools, maybe frame policy statements about what kind of Nashville you wanna live in, and what kind of transportation you'd like to see that maybe isn't as present in Nashville today, and share that with your elected leaders, be it your city council person or your mayor or your governor. I think now is a great time for young people to start speaking up and making their voices heard. And I promise you, your elected officials will listen and they will respond.
Thank you. I'm sure she will be pleased to hear that answer.
Sure.
So this is something that's going to hit a little closer to home. So get ready.
Right.
Okay. Someone asked, Lyft and companies like Lyft and Uber, they are considered disruptors to the transportation system, and they kind of capture some of the similar riders as a transit system would capture. But the question for you is, do you feel companies such as Lyft and Uber, are they aiding in the decline of the public transit system?
That's a good question. And I think the evidence, at least insofar as Lyft is concerned, is no. You take a city like Chicago, 64% of the trips on our platform are either starting or stopping at a transit stop. And so people tend to use our services in a highly used transit community. They tend to use us as last mile, first mile transportation, which is fine. And I actually, as I've said, I think our transit systems provide a service that no private entity can replace. And what's the most important is that we continue strengthening the ecosystem, both within transit as well as around transit, so that people have maximum access to the things they need. Now, I will say that there are things that we do that transit doesn't do. Door-to-door service is different than point-to-point. And as a result, I think they are complementary. I don't think they are things that take away.
And I've heard of some communities the transit system is partnering with the Lyft or an Uber to provide that, to provide services where they can't, because there's some communities where transit can't go, but Lyft or Uber can. Yeah. So I think it's a great opportunity for partnership.
That's what I think is that actually what we should be doing right now is we should be trying to figure out how to partner better. And actually COVID gave us some examples of this, where bus service was shortened or eliminated. We gap filled in conjunction with many of the transit agencies across the country. So there's enough room for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So we have another question from our audience. Ms. Liza Joffrion has a question, and she wants, I think, Liza, can you turn your video on and ask a question of Mr. Foxx, please? If you're there, Wonder Twin.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I don't see a way to turn on video, but I'm glad you can hear me. Thank you for taking my question. It's Liza Joffrion with CDM Smith, and this goes back to the topic of gentrification, and making sure that in disadvantaged areas where we're making these transportation investments and we want the current residents to benefit from those investments. You already mentioned a tool of using land trusts, but just wondered, what are your thoughts about pairing transportation grants with grants or investments in affordable housing and linking the funding for those two? And also wondering if you have examples of any place in the US that is having success with ensuring that affordable housing does remain in areas where there's transportation investment going on.
Yeah, I think one of the better examples I can think of is the Crenshaw line in Los Angeles. It's a light rail segment that's running into one of the more lower income parts of Los Angeles. And partly because we did one of the local hire pilot programs there, a number of nearby residents are actually working to build that line, which is giving them both access to work that's close by home, but also in some cases work that pays more than what they might have been doing before. And that, of course, affects the degree of affordability in the community. A number of cities, and Charlotte is one of them actually, where we put transit in place, light rail. We actually tried to zone areas with the idea of dedicating some of that property in the half mile on either side of the line to affordable housing. And that's another strategy that can be utilized. So it doesn't always require the creation of a land trust. Sometimes you kind of forecast for the development community where you want to see affordable housing, and hopefully the economies work for that to occur. The last thing is that I don't know if Nashville has a housing trust fund, but again, that is a tool that can be utilized to gap fill, to make it economically viable for affordable housing to be placed in areas that are fast growing and maybe near transit areas. And so that may be another strategy. Again, I can't tell you that we have a perfect example anywhere. I think you'll pick up different lessons in different places, but we're still trying to find the perfect place. So maybe Nashville will be it.
That would be great.
I'm rooting for you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Liza, for your question. We also have a question from Hunter G. Hunter, are you ready? I think with, I'm not sure if you're going to do video or not, but are you ready?
Yes, thank you. And I too, I'm not sure if I can get my video going here, but Mr. Foxx, thank you for your time, sharing your insights, and thanks for your leadership nationally on these issues. You've addressed a lot of what I was interested in hearing about, but I'll maybe scratch a little deeper. Often, understandably, due to damaging history of transportation in urban neighborhoods of color, there are real fears that new infrastructure and development is designed to push communities out. Bike lanes, enhanced transit, greenways, and transit-oriented development can often feel threatening to longtime residents and neighborhoods. Your advice of engaging and listening and speaking in non-planner language is super important and helpful. Thank you for that. However, market forces, rising property values, and taxes are all part of the challenge in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. You've talked a bit about gentrification, and I am perhaps curious about, the conversation often begins in being divisive, and so it's a challenge in our communities to get to those honest discussions among neighbors, among city leaders, among planners, and so on. So I would love to hear your advice about how we get beyond the divisiveness and really get to meaningful solutions.
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me start with and I have not done research on this, so I'm really offering up a hypothesis here. But I think one of the things, empathy is really, really critical. I don't think this kind of work can actually be done without it, to be honest. And, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who maybe their grandparents, maybe their parents bought the house 2 generations ago and remembers before there was a freeway or something that happened, and remembers neighbors that had to be relocated, and remembers the grocery store that used to be there and the person who used to let you put a IOU down. It's gone, and that community is gone. And from that perspective, it feels like you've subsidized the growth of someone across town. And let me unpack that a little bit, because the things that you lost, the things that lost both social value, cultural value, economic value, you lost. And yet the city's growing, the city's becoming more attractive for other people. Other parts of the city that maybe didn't have that same set of problems or set of decisions that affected them didn't have it as an obstruction to growth or what have you. And so there's a sense that, you know, people have paid a price for the growth that people who live across town are enjoying. And that is why this conversation is, I think, a much more specific and a much more perhaps painful, but also a much more necessary discussion that we have in every community, in every place where decision making is occurring. And the solutions to this have to be crafted by the community, by you, by them, by all of us. And I don't always know what they look like. You know, it may be that that there are things that might be great to have for Nashville that you guys decide not to do because there's social capital cost to it. There may be things that you've been dying to do that are great ideas that they get done because of the social capital value. But I really think we have to factor that in order to reconstruct a stronger fabric in this country. And again, no one's gotten this right. You know, we had a lot of misses. We've had a lot of things that have been neutral, but finding great examples of where this has been done really well are few and far between. I'm not saying that to be discouraging. I'm saying it, you know, to say that the work is really hard. And this is harder than having an abstract, uncomfortable conversation. This is an uncomfortable conversation that has tax consequences, economic consequences, political consequences, social consequences, community consequences. So, but it's why we have to have it. So that may not be the best answer, but it's the best answer I can give you right now.
Thank you so much. Sometimes the truth hurts, but it is what it is. And I really appreciate, and I want to echo your saying something that I say all the time. You know, we planners and architects and engineers, we think quite highly of ourselves and our professional accolades. And we like to use our fancy planning and engineering words when we're going out talking to the community. And they don't give a flying you know what about any of those fancy words. It's more so just connecting with people and, you know, working with them and trying to understand what their needs are and how we can make improvements based on those needs. And I think the Civic Design Center does a great job with the program Design Your Neighborhood. They're working with kids in the community to help the kids understand, you know, one, this is a viable profession. And you, there may be something that, it may be something you want to consider. But two, you have a voice in deciding what your neighborhood should look like. You have a voice in deciding how your community should grow, and you should use your voice to do that. So kudos. That was one of the reasons that you know, I was just totally attracted to the Civic Design Center and why I'm on their board today. So kudos to Gary and his team for putting together programs like that to get everyone involved in the process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary. Thank you so much, Mr. Foxx, Anthony, for your time and just all of the information that you shared with us today. That is probably one of the most comprehensive reviews of how transportation has impacted certain communities that typically don't get spotlighted. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'll echo that. Thank you, Anthony, for just giving us the time to be able to go deeper. And again, the conversation was just so inspirational, and I know will be useful for us here in Nashville. And also, the Lyft office here is just next door to the Civic Design Center's office on 2nd Avenue. So when you're able to come to Nashville, we want to make sure that we can meet you in person and continue the conversation and vision moving forward. Also, I just want to update everybody on our progress. We are over $8,500 towards our $12,000 goal today. So you can still give to get us to that $12,000 goal for our big payback day. I just want to thank you all again for attending this event, for being here as supporters and sponsors of the Civic Design Center. I want to thank my co-hosts and companions today, Michelle and Tanisha. Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. We have so much more in store as we're coming out of being secluded and separated from people. We're going to be out in the communities more with tactical urbanism projects and beginning programming, especially outdoors, in the coming months. So if you are in a neighborhood and you'd like to participate in some of these tactical urbanism projects, you can sign up to volunteer and actually be a part of that process. And you can also, if you see a place in your neighborhood or in your community that you think could be a much better or safer place, you can input that project idea and it can potentially be a turbo project or tactical urbanism project for the future. So if you can do that, you can go to our website, Civic Design Center, or go to tacticalurbanism.org and put that information in. So stay tuned. We want to engage with you. We want you to be an active part of our work and our mission. In closing, I just want to thank the entire team here today at Gary Music Productions for your support as a sponsor and for hosting us and putting on such a beautiful program. Again, Tanisha and Michelle, thank you. And of course, Anthony and your team for working with us. And to close out, I just want to thank everyone and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.